In relation to the fourth matter arising out of today's evidence, namely the approach of the Crown to certain evidence which could have a bearing on racial motivation, I do not consider that I will be assisted by further exploration of that matter with this witness. It can be developed in submission. I shall refuse that aspect of the application. All the other issues relate to the case of Simon San. For a number of reasons, I propose to take the following course in relation to these. Ms. Mitchell should submit a written document setting out precisely the areas which she wishes to explore and the reasons for doing so. That will allow me more clearly to understand the issues which are raised, to consider whether I would be assisted by exploration of them, and whether there is force in the submission of Mr. Duncan. In the event that further evidence will be required, that will be done by issuing a supplementary Rule 8 request to the witness. Could we have the witness back, please? Mr. Logue, that completes your oral evidence. If the inquiry requires any further evidence from you, it will issue a supplementary Rule 8 request. So thank you very much for coming back to give evidence today. Again, I'm grateful for your time. I'm going to adjourn briefly to allow the next witness to be introduced, and you'll then be free to go.
Thank you.
We'll adjourn briefly for that purpose. Good afternoon, Dr. Jones. Would you say the words of the affirmation after me? I solemnly, sincerely and truly
I solemnly, sincerely and truly
declare and affirm
declare and affirm
that I will tell the truth,
that I will tell the truth,
the whole truth,
the whole truth,
and nothing but the truth.
nothing but the truth.
Ms. Thompson.
Good afternoon. You are Dr. Peter Jones.
I am
How old are you, Dr. Jones?
63.
And am I right to understand that you are a chartered psychologist and also a former police officer?
That's right.
Before I ask you any questions, can I invite you to open up the blue folder in front of you? And within that folder, there should be a copy of your inquiry statement, which is SPPI 00526. We'll bring that up on the screen. So here is your statement of Dr. Peter Jones, taken on the 13th of March of 2024. And if we can go to the very final page, we should see that it was signed by you on the 11th of April of this year. Your signature has been redacted from the version on the screen, but hopefully will be showing in the hard copy in the folder in front of you. Your statement concludes with the words, I believe that the facts stated in this witness statement are true. I understand that this statement may form part of the evidence before the inquiry and be published on the inquiry's website. So you signed this statement, you prepared and signed the statement in the knowledge that it would become evidence before the chair to the inquiry and that it would be published on the inquiry's website.
I did.
Did you do your best to answer as fully and accurately as you could all of the questions that were asked of you in interview?
I did.
I want to begin by asking you some questions about your career in fairly short compass. Am I right to understand that you were a police officer between 1979 and 2001?
Yes.
And that all of your service was south of the border with England?
Yes.
Okay. And that your rank at the time that you left the police in 2001 was inspector?
Yes.
Can we look at paragraph 3 of your statement, please? Here you explain that you left policing in 2001 when you got a doctorate and set up your own business, Shire Professional Chartered Psychologists. You spent the next 22 years mainly carrying out research, training consultancy around implicit bias and working with implicit bias tests, although you always maintained a small part of the business relating to assessment and evaluation. So you explained that you got a doctorate in 2001. What was your doctorate in?
It was in psychometric test development.
How long did that take to complete?
4 years.
Was that a full-time or part-time course?
It was 2 years full-time and 2 years part-time.
Okay. So when did you graduate with your doctorate relative to when you left policing?
I graduated in 2000 and I left the following year.
All right. So had you taken time away from policing in order to complete your studies?
I worked part-time for 2 years while I did my PhD full-time.
All right. And with which university did you undertake your PhD?
Wolverhampton Business School.
Can we look at paragraph 4, please? You explain that your professional qualifications relevant to this field of work are that you're a chartered psychologist, chartered scientist and associate fellow of the British Psychological Society. You also have a police trainer's certificate and you attended a 10-week residential course for police trainers and you're well versed in the process and practices of policing. So these are your professional qualifications that sit over and above the doctorate that you hold.
Yes.
With your doctorate being a PhD, did you require to do undergraduate study and a master's before you embarked on the PhD?
Yeah, I did an undergraduate degree at the Open University and a master's degree at Goldsmiths, University of London.
The Open University and degree, what was your subject for your undergraduate
Psychology.
degree? And when did you graduate?
1993.
Was that a full-time or part-time course?
That was part-time.
Again, whilst you were in the police?
Yes.
Okay. And the Masters from Goldsmiths, was that again a full-time or part-time course?
That was full-time.
And did that require you to take a time away from policing, or did you have a very busy schedule?
I just had a very, very busy life for 7 months.
Okay. And what was the subject of your Masters?
Psychological assessment in organisations.
And your PhD, you said, was in psychometric testing.
Mhm.
Paragraph 5, you say, I retired and closed the business in June 2023. I've continued doing some work in Canada, predominantly around bias testing, and I still administer and research around bias testing in the UK. I still carry out some work relating to setting testing for one of the big UK police forces and bias testing police recruits in a smaller police force. My work is now exclusively around bias testing. I no longer carry out any training or consultancy, but I obviously have to keep my finger on the implicit bias pulse for bias testing. So after a career of approximately 22 years within this particular field, you've retired and closed your business. But seem to still be doing quite a lot of work.
Nothing that requires travel is my rule, yeah.
I see. So today I want to focus on asking questions about unconscious bias, bias testing and training in relation to unconscious bias. At paragraph 6, you were asked to explain what unconscious or implicit bias is. Are those two terms interchangeable, unconscious and implicit bias?
Yeah, implicit bias is the more accurate description. It's the one which is used in the academic world. I think unconscious bias was coined as a phrase probably by Harvard University, which has sort of picked up its, the main use is now unconscious bias, but the correct term is implicit bias. They are the same thing.
Let's look at what you say about the concept in paragraph 6. We often talk about it simply being our unintended people preferences, our preferences to see particular groups of people positively or negatively. The research on implicit bias goes back to the early 1970s, and there is quite a long research history. Fundamentally, implicit bias is about the way we make judgments about people, and it is fundamentally embedded in our neurology. The idea is that we have processes in the brain which are fairly instinctive, automatic, and which get activated without our conscious control. There are other neurological processes which are the opposite of implicit processes. These processes are conscious, they're much slower in their operation than implicit. You can scroll down, please, thanks. Implicit processes and require attentional resources. They contrast with implicit processes, instinctive, very fast and automatic processes of the brain, which are partly based upon our anthropology of how our brains developed, and all animals have these implicit processes. They are instinctive responses based in the ancient neurology in the brain's amygdala, as the neuroscientists talk about it, our fight or flight response. So you give an overview in paragraph 6 of what is meant by implicit or unconscious bias. And in paragraph 7, you describe these processes as a cognitive shortcut that allow you to make judgments in the blink of an eye without engaging your conscious thinking.
Yes.
In paragraph 8, you explain that these judgments or decisions can be positive or negative, so you can create either positive or negative attributions to particular groups, often based upon experience. And if we look about halfway down this paragraph, you say, although we might consciously reject a stereotype about a particular group, our implicit brain may have already wired and continued to wire that stereotype into our brains. Can you explain a little bit more about that, the concept of wiring a stereotype and the competition between the conscious rejection of the stereotype and the implicit bias?
So repeated exposure to a particular pattern, whether that's from our own experiences or whether it's from the media or whether it's from what society tells us about particular groups. If we get repeatedly exposed to those associations, we start to create a neural pathway in the brain between the group and these positive or negative constructs. So even though we believe ourselves to be fair and equitable and to reject a stereotype about a particular group, those neural pathways are still there. We still make the association implicitly and unconsciously between a positive or negative attribute and a particular group. And it's really the job of the conscious to intervene in that and to convert that impulse into fair and equitable behaviours. And we have some specialist neurons in the brain designed to do that. They're called von Econon neurons. And what they do is they stop those waves of impulse that are coming from the amygdala from breaking through into behaviour.
Thank you. If we can scroll down a little bit to the top of the next page, please. The second half of this paragraph, you explain that when we're stressed, when we're rushed, or when we're overworked, and that, you note, is the kind of environment a lot of people work in, we fall back onto these shortcut neural pathways for making the judgments we need to make. And that's why implicit bias affects the behaviour that we exhibit and the decisions that we then make. Why does this happen when we're stressed or rushed or overworked?
It's to do with the processing capacity of the brain. So the neocortex, the new part of the brain that we've developed as human beings, is relatively limited. It's got a fraction of the processing power of our old brain that we've had for millennia. It can only process a certain amount of information at any one time, and I often talk about it. Does give you an analogy, it processes about 40 bits of information at any one moment. So if I gave you a picture in your head of that as a table tennis ball, and then equated that to the processing power of the unconscious mind, the implicit, it's a ball about 2.4 meters across. It's about 200,000 times the processing power. And so when we overwhelm the frontal lobes of the brain, they fall back onto this massive resource that they have in the background. The problem with it is that emotional or cognitive load eats up those resources of the frontal lobe. So when we are stressed, in danger, rushed, we tend then to fall back onto those implicit connections for making the rapid judgments about people.
Thank you. I want to ask you some questions about the development of training in this area. And if we can scroll to paragraph 10, you explain that this has been an iterative process. To start with, it was very much about awareness. People didn't know what this notion of implicit bias was. If we skip a few lines, you say that within a couple of years, people started to say, well, that's really interesting, but so what? How can we do something about it? So should we understand that there was a shift away from a focus on having an awareness of unconscious bias towards what can we do about this? How can we correct this?
Absolutely, that shift from awareness to action.
You explain at paragraph 11, I don't think we can eradicate it, that is implicit bias, because it's part of that process which we need to live our lives. So what we can help people do is mitigate the effects as best we can. So it's not about eradicating this process. On one level, is this almost life-saving in extremis? Is it that part of the brain?
Yeah, so every time we need to make a judgment about new people, if we didn't have that capacity to fall back onto those really fast neural pathways, the very first person we meet in the day, and we had to make a judgment about how they stood, how they dressed, their voice, the frontal lobes would be overwhelmed and we would come to a grinding halt. So we pass a lot of that routine processing back into the unconscious, into all those wired pathways that we've acquired in the course of our lives.
So it's not something that you can eradicate. It's part of the process you need to live your life. It's about mitigating the effects of the bias. And you explain at paragraph 12, I'll read this short. If we look about halfway down the paragraph, you say that if we slow the thinking down by putting little barriers in the way, little pauses in the thinking, we can mitigate bias by giving the conscious processes time to engage. Can you say a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so we know that the unconscious operates somewhere between 30 and 100 milliseconds. Which is actually faster than the eyes can even fully perceive the image. But the conscious brain doesn't cut in until about 400 milliseconds, 4/10 of a second. So we're never able to get in soon enough. So all we can do really is to delay the thinking, to introduce those little thinking spaces between the impulse and the action. in the hope that we can get people then to rethink the situation. So would I be thinking the same if this person was different on this occasion? Am I really thinking about this in the right way? And organisations have worked to put those little thinking spaces, even if it's just a 3 or 10-second space, into people's thinking.
Can you give an example of how an individual might introduce a thinking pause into their day-to-day life or their working life?
So if you just take a performance management or recruiting scenario, the little gap might be, the next time I am sifting CVs for a job as a junior lawyer, I will stop for 10 seconds and ask myself the question whether I've allowed the school that they've come from, for example, or I've allowed the university that they've gone to have an adverse impact. So all it does really is give them a bit of a thinking space. And organisations have started to just introduce that little opportunity. And I think Oakland Police did something very similar with pursuits, where they insisted on people having the thinking space. So they were not allowed to do a pursuit on foot unless they had another officer with them. And that wasn't done just for safety, it was done to give them the thinking time. So while that officer was catching up, that red mist of the chase was able to die away. But it's just producing those little opportunities. And I think Jennifer Heberhart, who's the professor of psychology at, I think she's at Madison now, Wisconsin-Madison, she talks about a website, which is a little bit like Facebook. I think it's in the UK, it's called Front Door, where people discuss, for example, local crime. And she had a problem with racial profiling on that website. And you can see it on Facebook groups all the time, can't you? There's some kids hanging around at the end of the road. And they start to make assumptions about those people based upon ethnicity, age, etc. And she suggested that they introduce a little break in that. So before you could post something, you had to answer a couple of questions, which is what you're reporting got the descriptions properly? And are you being very specific about what it is that they're doing wrong? And she coined the phrase, if you're going to be suspicious, you have to be specific. And that's something which we try to introduce to police intelligence in one police force by asking them not to pass information, intelligence information, out to operational frontline officers without a certain degree of detail. So that you didn't just give people a very vague description, you gave them 3 or 4 descriptors so that they would not automatically assume that just because that guy was a particular ethnic group, that he was the one who must be talked about. So those were the kind of thinking gaps that we try to get them to think and put into policy and practice.
You explain, however, at paragraph 13, an irony perhaps that the requirement on an individual to introduce this thinking gap actually increases the cognitive load. You explain here, I think one of the issues around the actions around implicit bias is that if we heap more load onto individuals, we ask people to be personally responsible for their biases, but it's yet another load. We know that emotional and cognitive load causes people to fall back onto their biases. Can you explain a little bit more about that tension between the need to impose thinking time as a way to mitigate bias, but that thinking time or the requirement to introduce thinking time actually increasing the cognitive load that can lead to these biased shortcuts?
Yeah, I think that the cognitive load comes not necessarily from trying to introduce the thinking time, because that has the opposite effect. It comes from organisations inserting things into the process. The thing that springs to mind in some respects is policing uses a national decision-making model, where it has steps through which the officer is supposed to go when they're making a decision. Well, that's just cognitive load, especially when you're making a decision in the blink of an eye almost. You place additional cognitive load onto people then, while they're thinking about following policy and procedure, rather than dealing with the situation and hopefully looking to mitigate their biases in the scenario. But yeah, I mean, what we do effectively by introducing that is introduce something else for them to think about. And I think if you're going to do it, what you need to do is to take away some of the other demands from it. So get away from loading people with procedures and policies that they have to follow, which are complex, because people do not do complexity well, especially when they're stressed and they're rushed. They fall back onto those implicit biases for decisions.
Thank you for clarifying that. That was my misunderstanding. I had understood that it was the requirement to impose a thinking break that was increasing the cognitive
No,
load,
it's
but
the
it's
general
not the
load.
break, it's the procedure that has to be gone through, the following of a process or a policy that adds to the cognitive load. And so what I think you were saying is that if this can be simplified, it's more likely to be effective.
Yeah, it's a bit like designing a website, isn't it? Just 2 clicks, not 22 clicks to get to where you want to go.
You've spoken about introducing thinking time. Is there anything else that an individual can do to mitigate bias?
There's actually a host of things. I did a review some years ago with 2 other psychologists on behalf of the, I'm trying to think of the organisation now, Quality Challenge Unit at the Department of Education. And we know quite a bit about what we can do to mitigate things like, not reinforcing stereotypes in the first place, because we know that when people are exposed to stereotypes, they tend then to use those stereotypes because it rehearses the neural pathway. So trying not to reinforce those stereotypes. I'll give you a good example of that, by the way. I went to the Metropolitan Police website, and this must be about 5 years ago now, onto their Twitter feed, and I did a very quick analysis. It took me about 20 minutes of the faces that appeared on the website, on the Twitter feed, for people who were either wanted, who were sought for identification, were missing people. And what we found with that was that black people were much more likely to appear on the Twitter feed if they were wanted or committing an offence, disproportionately to the proportions in the population and within the criminal population. Well, every time my Twitter feed went past, although I reject the stereotype about young black men and crime myself, my unconscious mind is wiring that stereotype into my neural pathways all of the time. And although they didn't like it very much when I pointed it out to them, I've been back since, and I did the same for West Yorkshire Police and Greater Manchester Police, and there was no disproportionality in what they were doing. It was very much in line with their local populations. But that constant reinforcement, we can avoid doing that. And I think the Metropolitan Police have had issues recently with taking down the photographs of gang members, for example, in the briefing rooms, because every time you walk past them, your unconscious mind wires that connection between black men and crime into your neural pathways to make them stronger for later on, so when you end up using them. So I think there's some things which we can do, and I did produce a list of 10 things that we can better do, which includes not reinforcing them, creating the thinking gaps in it, and other things which we can do which don't require massive amounts of resource or time, because that's what people don't have. They don't have time or resource.
I think that list might actually be included in a PowerPoint presentation that you prepared.
It likely is. If it's not, it's in the handout that went with the course, yeah.
Perhaps we can revisit this issue then when we go through the PowerPoint, which is something I would like to do with you today. So we were talking about the shift in training from awareness to action, as you put it. And you also explain in your statement that there was then another shift in training away from the individual approach to an organisational approach. Can you say a little bit more about that?
I think although some organisations wanted personal responsibility to be reinforced with the individual, which I think is important. At the end of the day, it's down to individuals to try and mitigate their biases. A lot of what organisations did and do reinforces that. It creates the systems around which people struggle then to mitigate their bias, whether it's the intelligence system that's deployed, whether it's the recruiting process that's being deployed. So organisations have been really slow to do this, because if you've got people who are under a lot of load and are falling back onto their biases, one way around it is to take the system that's feeding those biases and redesign it not to do it. And I'll give you an example in a simple recruiting scenario. If when you're sifting CVs for a job, you take the names off, you are much less likely to see people's gender and race biases coming through in the decisions that they take to either accept or reject. Now, that's not necessarily within the gift of the recruiter, but it is in the gift of the organisation to say the system that we use no longer has names and dates of birth, for example, or even schools on the CV, because that triggers these biases in people. So that was a kind of organisational fix. But organisational fixes in terms of how they run their meetings, you know, who gets to contribute in a meeting was another one. The systems that said we do not start with the senior person's comment, we start with the junior person's comment and work our way up, because people tend to fall in with the opinion of the senior person. So it's lots of little strategies that organisations needed to build into their systems to make it less likely that individual biases would break through into the behaviour and into the decisions that were taken.
You explain in your statement, paragraph 14, that you then took a final step in the sort of iterative development of your training programme and moved towards offering Train the Trainer courses. You explain in paragraph 14, there was only one me, even though there were other people working in the field. It was quite an expensive option to have a subject matter expert come in multiple times to deliver training across the staff group. So you developed a Train the Trainers course with a licensing arrangement back in 2015. And the idea was that you would come in and do 3 days with the trainers and then go away. You would write materials for context specific, and there was a licensing arrangement in place. So that was the sort of the end point of the development of your training package. Yeah. I want to ask some questions about evaluation of training. You say at paragraph 15, the one shortcoming I see in the training is that nobody wanted to do the evaluation. Nobody wanted to say, well, is this working? What are the processes by which we work out whether that half day of training is a good investment? And that's typically what it looked like. It was typically 3 hours of training. Awareness was about an hour, but the full course was about 3 hours, split between application, context, and action. I called it the 3 A's: awareness, application, and action. There was very little interest in evaluation beyond the simple evaluation sheets at the end of the session, which organisations often hand out to delegates. That can be things like, was the lunch okay, or what was the room like? They didn't often ask, well, what have you done? I've seen very little or no robust evaluation. And you go on to say at paragraph 16 that even if you put evaluation into a bid, it would be taken out by the organisation. They want to do the training, move on and tick the box. I think there's an element of saying, oh, unconscious bias training, we've done that, we're moving on from that. There's been very little good evaluation. And you say elsewhere in your statement that often there's no commitment after an event to continuing unconscious bias training. It's a tick box exercise, zero evaluation or desire to see what the impact might be. And you conclude later in your statement by saying that you've put this one into the too difficult box because people just don't want to put money into creating a robust model where you've got the data coming in such volumes that you can say something robust, and you suggest that you would need to see hundreds, if not thousands, of evaluations, and there just isn't the interest or the budget for that. So what are the implications of organisations choosing not to evaluate the effectiveness of this sort of training?
Well, they just keep repeating the same mistakes, don't they? First of all, they've spent an awful lot of money usually in putting that training into position. So you would never buy, a new fleet of vehicles and not test it out to see if it did the job that you thought it was going to do. But with training, we seem quite happy to take the word of somebody at the end of it to say how much they enjoyed the course, how useful they thought it was, as some kind of indication of effectiveness. But we've seen very little in terms of actually following people up after the event. Because the fundamental of this is, what is it you're setting out to achieve? A lot of training that you see, the short ones in particular, want to do awareness. They want to say, you should know a little bit about this because it might be impacting your job. But the really difficult stuff is, well, have we affected behavioural change? Have we made people do and see things differently? And that's a really difficult one to measure and to disentangle from all the other stuff that's going on in an organisation. And you know, if you go back to the kind of academic model, people are asking, well, where's the control group? You know, and when we actually did have a study some years ago where we started it with a control group where we ran half of them through and half of them not through. And very quickly the organisation decided it was too much like hard work and they weren't going to do it. But that was the basics, you know. People have had the training, people have not had the training. Do we see differences in the outcomes later in the day? And we've got a similar study running at the moment. It's actually within clinical psychology training, where they are not just testing people and giving them training, but they're then looking at the outcomes of the selection decisions they made before and after the intervention. But they've really struggled to get people to participate. You know, they only wanted 40. I think they've got 33 at the last count, and it's been 2 years in the making. It's a really difficult one, getting people to do really powerful evaluation rather than just taking people's word for whether they did or didn't like it.
You explain at paragraph 17 that you've had 2 studies in Canada where you've actually bias tested delegates before and after training, and it suggests the training does have an effect on people's bias levels. What it does to people's behaviour is still a bit of a mystery. I think we've got no firm evidence in terms of behavioural change. Is that because of a lack of data from evaluation, because evaluation processes simply
It's this
aren't
behavioural
undertaken?
problem again, isn't it? What's the metric for the behaviour? What do we hope to change? Now, we know the bias test scores have fallen, but has that led to fewer complaints? I think this was actually either a probation or a prison setting. So has it led to reduced complaints from the inmates? Has it led to better relationships? Has it led to more women being promoted? We don't know those behavioural outcomes. We just know that as a result of the training, with a control group who didn't have the training, that the bias tests fell in the group who'd had the training.
Can you tell us a little about bias testing? What does that involve?
So it's an online test. It developed by Harvard originally in 1998, and then we've developed a version in about 2009. And it's based upon that notion of the association between groups and positive and negative attributes for the groups. So if you take 2 groups, a black group and a white group, the test throws an individual a series of photographs, and it asks them to sort them according to a rule. It gives them the rule. So the first rule is, if it's a black face, hit the right key, sort it right. If it's a white key, hit the left key, sort it left. It then starts to mix words in between the photographs, and they're good words. Peaceful, calm, helpful, cooperative, versus bad words, aggressive, uncooperative, demanding. And it asks you to sort them, and it gives you a rule. It says, if it's a good word, I want you to sort it right with the black faces. If it's a bad word, I want you to sort it left with the good faces, with the white faces. What it then does is, when you've done about 60 of those, it changes the sorting rule. Now it wants you to sort the good words with the white faces and the bad words with the black faces. And it gives you a time to adjust for the changeover. What it then does, it compares the 2 halves of the test. It wants to know, where did you slow down? Where did you make mistakes? Where did you speed up? Because if you have those positive or negative associations about a particular group and particular positive or negative constructs or ideas, it interferes with your capacity to sort. So you want to put it over there because the rule says so, but your implicit biases are hardwired, and what they do is say they're quicker and faster than the conscious mind. It wants you to put them on the other side. And whilst you're correcting for that, it slows you down and it makes mistakes. So it calibrates that as into the likelihood that you would or wouldn't let those biases impinge on the decisions that you take.
Gosh, and you explain at paragraph 17 that you have 2 studies in Canada. Are these studies that you've personally carried out? You've made it clear that you work in Canada as well as in the UK, where you've bias tested delegates before and after training. And those studies suggested that the training does have an effect on people's bias levels. So should we understand then that there's a difference in the results that you got through the bias testing before and after the delegates had undertaken training?
Yeah, so there was a significant drop-off in the bias test scores. I mean, they were more neutral after the training than they were before the training.
And when they're not neutral, are they indicative of a bias in one direction or another?
Yeah, so generally speaking, and we've got 120 different bias tests on the platform, the data always tends to be skewed against the minority group. So if it's a black-white test, it tends to be skewed that there are way more people with a bias against black people than white people. The gender tests tend to be skewed against women. The LGBTQ tests tend to be skewed against LGBT groups. And so it goes on. The minority or more suppressed group tends to be the group for whom more negativity is associated.
You say at paragraph 17, what it does to people's behaviour is still a bit of a mystery. I think we've got no firm evidence in terms of behavioural change. And elsewhere in your statement, I think at paragraph 29, you say we don't know if unconscious bias training works because we've never evaluated it. Is that because of the lack of interest in evaluation?
It's a really difficult one. I mean, training is not well evaluated generally, is it? You know, you go on the course, they send you a sheet to say what you think of it. Nobody comes back to see if your skill set has improved 3, 6, 9, 24 months later. We just blindly think that since we've dedicated half a day to training that it will have made a difference. But we don't really have the mechanisms for following it up, and we often don't want to allocate the budget for following it up.
I wonder if we can turn to paragraph 21 of your statement, where you talk about the value of training of this type in the context of policing. And you say at 21, I've been asked how unconscious bias training functions as a tool when it comes to policing. I think there's 2 things. The first thing is that there is some research suggesting that awareness of our biases can help us to mitigate their effects. So if I know, for example, that I have a particular bias based on race or gender, it gives me the opportunity to create mitigations and barriers. Sometimes it's just a little script in their head which says, would I be reacting in the same way if this was a man rather than a woman, a white person rather than a black person? And again, is that about building in these little opportunities for thinking?
It is, yeah,
time?
but it's one of the simplest checks, isn't it, of any kind of biases. Would I be reacting in the same way if a disabled person had said that? Mm-hmm. Would I react in the same way if somebody from the LGBT community had said it? It gets us insight into how our thinking works.
Continuing on to paragraph 22, you say, I think that there's the element of awareness of people, and certainly my experience of dealing with test takers is that if you increase their awareness of their biases, then there are certain people who will reflect and act on that. It actually makes them feel bad as people. There is some research suggesting that about 25% of people, regardless of having insight, will just carry on as normal. I think that we remain positive because about 2/3 of people, if they're given insight into their biases, actually do something about it. Whether they do that because they've got some kind of moral compass, or whether they do that because they know the organisation is very attentive to that aspect and there might be censure if they don't get on top of their biases, we don't know. They do seem to be able to be motivated. Trish Devine in her research talks about it as the motivation to control bias. So you're saying here that an awareness plus motivation has the potential to bring about changes in behaviour.
That certainly seems to be what Trish Devine's work had suggested, and I think that the numbers that in that particular piece come from an overlaying of Trish Devine's work with some work by a psychologist at Sussex University some years later from the British Social Attitude Survey, when he asked the question, you know, if you've got a bias, are you motivated to control it? And he started to get a picture of what the motivation to control was. So there's about 1 in 4 people who, even if they know they've got a bias, they don't care. as far as they're concerned, they're going to do what they want to do. But most of the people either are already motivated to control their biases, or they can be motivated, even if that is a threat of censure on occasions.
So should we understand that of those who are susceptible to motivation and don't fall within that 25% who are not, some might be motivated because they have a strong moral compass, so the motivation is internal to them, if you like. Others are not so motivated, but external factors such as the possibility of sanction or censure might be sufficient to bring their behaviour back on track.
Yeah, and the norms of the organisation are part and parcel of that. It isn't always necessarily, they might know that they're not going to be censured by the organisation, but to know that it's not an attitude that colleagues would tolerate, for example, that they will be seen badly by colleagues if they speak in a particular way or say or do particular things. I can't remember the exact numbers, but about 1/3 of people have got a internal motivation anyway. About 1/3 of people can be motivated if they know they have a bias, and it leaves us then with 7% of people who can be motivated by the censure, and 25% who don't care.
You explain in paragraph 24 that the effect of this motivation can be short-lived if it's not reinforced. If you commit to doing specific things to mitigate bias and start to embed that within processes, there's a better chance of long-term change.
Yeah.
Tell us a little bit more about the need to reinforce.
Yeah, and this comes from Trish Devine's work, where she bias tested people, gave them the results of their bias test, and then some of them went through a training package on implicit bias, and some of them, I think, were given a health and safety training package, and then they revisited them a couple of weeks later, and they found that there was still a residual for the people who had done the training and had the testing, and she could still detect that about 2 years later. But what she did in the intervening period, she actually gave them some diaries to keep. So they had to keep a diary of what they were doing to mitigate their biases, and that was what reinforced it. It was that embedding it into practice, so that, and what we think is that after a while that gets passed back into the unconscious. You no longer have to consciously think about that 3-second gap. The thinking is doing it for you. But if you just expect people to roll out the training course and you've inoculated them, I think you're probably on a hide into nothing.
So reinforcement means practice, and you explain elsewhere in your statement, I think at paragraph 71, that if a person isn't motivated, doesn't practice, then they will revert back to their old attitudes and behaviours.
Yes.
Can we skip back up to paragraph 23, please? You talk here about awareness at an organisational level. Organisations often don't necessarily want to look inside themselves and ask the question about their processes. I know there's a lot of discussion about institutional racism and chief constables saying that we are or we are not institutionally racist. But I think the unwillingness to look at our systems and processes is one of the indicators of that institutional racism. That we're not prepared to look at our processes, we want to foist the problem onto individuals. Whereas in actual fact, a lot of it is based on our systems. What calls to be attend, what calls to be not attend, what information is an operational officer given in response to a call. There's quite a bit of organisational responsibility there, which often gets abdicated back to the individual. Can you say a little bit more about that, the concept of organisational responsibility being passed back onto the individual?
I think there's, and certainly in England, the reluctance of chief officers to admit that their force is institutionally racist. And I think that they don't really understand it well. They seem to think it's some kind of a personal attack on every single one of their officers. In actual fact, what it is, it's a personal attack on the systems of that organisation, that we've not got the systems in place that don't prevent this happening. And the classic example, I think of it is, and again, this is England and Wales, but I've been monitoring the data in the national recruit process for about 13 years. There was adverse impact in the national recruit process every single year. And to me, when you're told that and you know it and you do nothing about it except blame the communities, which is what they did, they said, well, you know, it's the Asian community or the Pakistani community don't speak good English, or there's an educational issue, or there's a motivational issue, without actually looking inside for the systems that you have that cause that in the first place. And when they finally did it last year, you know, the results showed that they narrowed the gap, not entirely. There were still some groups who were struggling, but the gap narrowed significantly when they actually went through their materials. They've still got the same system, but they actually went through the materials looking for these places, these hot spots where bias might come back into the process. And sometimes it was just nuances of language, it was the way that things were structured. And they're starting to do it now with neurodiversity. You know, they're now looking at the recruiting and promotion processes and saying, well, how does a person with dyslexia or ADHD cope with this process, and how we can adapt to that. They've never done that, as far as I know, with race or gender.
I'd like to ask you about training that you gave to Police Scotland, and I suggest that we do this by looking at a PowerPoint presentation that you prepared and delivered in June of 2021. And if we could bring this up on the screen, it's WIT 00063. There are, I think, 39 slides, so this is going to be quite a quick trot through. But I understand from your statement, and I think what I would like to do, Dr. Jones, is just keep the slideshow on the screen. Mm-hmm. And if I need to refer back to your statement, I'll give you the paragraph number and I'll read from the hard copy. But you explain, I think, in paragraph 36, that this came about as a result of a call that you received from Inspector David Bradley, who had responsibility for officer safety training within Police Scotland at that time. And you record that Inspector Bradley mentioned the death of Sheku Bayo as being one of the motivations for introducing this type of training. You also explained that it was 3 hours of training and it was delivered remotely because of the lockdown restrictions that were in place in 2021. And a passage from Inspector Bradley's statement was read to you in the course of your interview, in which Inspector Bradley explained that the cohort were full-time officer safety training instructors. So that's who you were speaking to. It wasn't probationers or constables, it was OST instructors. I'm conscious of the time. I wonder, before we get into the meat of the presentation, if that might be a good
so that's a convenient point. We'll take a 15-minute break. Ms Thompson.
Thank you. I wonder if we can bring up the PowerPoint presentation again, please, Dr. Jones. So we see that this was commissioned by, the training was commissioned by Police Scotland, or for their benefit, and it concerns the subject of implicit bias in policing. There are, I think, 39 slides in this pack, so we won't be able to go through all of them in the time available to us, but I'm going to pick out a few and invite your comment on them. Let's look at slide 2, please, the session plan, just to see what your training covered. You've explained already this was a 3-hour session. So it looked at what is unconscious or implicit bias, how can it affect our people, decisions and policing, how might it affect officer decision making around the use of force, how might it affect the training we design and deliver, and what does the research say, what we can do about it, and generating actions and advice. Those were the themes that you were looking to cover in the course of the presentation. There's a nice quote on the following slide, slide 3. There are no bad people, just bad thinking habits. Unconscious bias is a thinking habit we have learned, which we can unlearn. Is that a statement that you would endorse?
Yeah, I mean, Tricia's denied saying that now, but I now claim that statement as mine, so.
All right. Can we go to slide 5, please? Can you talk us through this one?
Yeah, this comes from a book called Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman, and it explains the principle behind implicit and explicit thinking, conscious and conscious thinking. So it's fairly well known, I think. The only thing we've done is change it from a baseball to a tennis ball for the English and Scottish audiences. But if you ask people to calculate the answer to that question, so a bat and a ball costs £1.10p, the bat costs £1 more than the ball, how much does the ball cost? Most people say that the answer is 10p, because it feels like 10p, doesn't it? But it can't possibly be 10p, because if the bat is £1 more than the ball and the ball were 10p, then the bat would have to be £1.10p. There is only one correct answer, and that's 5 pence. So the ball is 5 pence, the bat is £1 more than that, so that makes it £1.05. Add the two together, and it's £1.10. So it's not a surprise when people get that wrong, and I've given that, by the way, to professors of maths, and they sometimes get it wrong as well. So it's not, don't feel bad if you get it wrong. It's not the fact that people get it wrong, because we instinctively, it feels like 10p. But the reality of it is that even if you say to people, it's not 10p, it's 5p, they don't seem to be able to rethink it. They can't, once they've got that 10p answer in their head, they don't seem able to dislodge it from their minds. And that's the thing about implicit biases. Not only is it instinctive, but once it's made a decision for you, getting it to unpick and reverse that decision is actually very, very tricky. So I use it to basically introduce the idea of implicit thinking, and we also then cover the difference between the instinctive, fast operating and the slow and conscious mind, in terms of the conscious mind will get you the answer to that question, and usually engineers are quite good at it because they've got a x minus y divided by 2 formula in their head. Most of the groups really struggle with it. But it's to highlight the nature of implicit bias, and most people get that wrong. They haven't seen it before.
So this is an example designed to illustrate the difference between the way that the unconscious mind works and the conscious mind works. Let's look very briefly at the next slide. For the benefit of anyone who might have been struggling with this example, you've done the sums and set out the correct answer there. Can we skip through to slide number 9? Implicit biases develop and are maintained from our culture, our experiences, and from the media we absorb. So you're explaining here where these biases come from. Are they learned then, essentially, our biases? Are they something that we're born with, or are they to do with our lived experience and our learning through life?
Yeah, so some of them, obviously our learned experiences, the patterns that we absorb. So, for example, male leaders is a pattern we see in lots of places. Women cleaners is a pattern we often see. But the culture also does that. It tells us what groups are the valuable groups in society and what groups are the less valuable groups. And then finally, you've got the media themselves. You know, what are the messages that you get from various media sources? On Metropolitan Police websites, a classic example of that, how it reinforces those biases.
You say being biased is part of who we are. We are all biased, and we have a bias blind spot.
Yeah.
What's
So
the-
the
sorry.
research would suggest that it's other people who have the biases. It's not us. That we can see it in other people, but we really struggle to see bias and prejudice in our own behaviour, in our own words. And it seems to be some kind of defence mechanism that we don't want to be able to see it. So we cut ourselves off from it and we see it as somebody else's problem.
Biases are easily triggered under cognitive or emotional load. You spoke about that this morning. But you add when tired or depleted of glucose.
Yeah, so effectively the brain is just a machine, isn't it? It runs on glucose. So when the glucose levels fall, we are more likely to fall back onto our bias levels. And you often hear people talk about them being angry with an H because they're hungry. And it's a lack of glucose which takes away our emotional regulation. And the study I often quote for that is a study in Israel with judges. And what they found was the decisions that judges made on parole decisions tended to be more harsh just before coffee breaks and just before lunch. As the glucose levels in the brain fell, they tended to be more likely to refuse a parole application at those times.
Can we move on to slide number 14, please? Can you talk us through this slide?
Right. It came about, I guess, because we were contacted by a police force who'd had some problems inside their professional standards department. So these are the people who investigate complaints against police. In particular, one black officer had been suspended for a period of 2 years on what turned out to be a misunderstanding between him and a complainant. But it got us thinking about the impact on the investigation of complaints against police and internal professional standards investigations. And if you remember when we spoke about the testing, we talked about groups, black people, white people, men, women, and we talked about the construct. So what is it that we're associating a group with? And we developed a specific test for professional standards in policing. And what we wanted to know was, do investigators in professional standards more strongly associate white people, black people, Asian people, and men or women with some of the more negative constructs around investigation? So do they see them as helpful and cooperative and open and honest, or do they see them as deceitful, dangerous predators, for example? And we took the test out to professional standards departments in 3 police forces. And what we did, we administered them to their investigators. And we were interested in, firstly, obviously, the proportions of people who have bias against particular groups, but also which groups they were biased against. And so if you move sort of left from right from Asian, what it tells us is that there are a small percentage of people, and the coloured bars, by the way, represent the 3 police forces involved. The reason there's 4 bars on the right-hand side is we did revisit one force 2 years later and retest them. And what you can see is there is a small amount of what I'm calling pro-Asian, anti-white bias. So they are more likely to associate white people with being uncooperative, with being predators, with being liars. And much larger proportions of them, between 15 and 20 odd %, more likely to associate Asian people with that. You see the same but a more pronounced effect where we use the black test, and there they've got black and white faces on this idea of whether people were being honest and cooperative. And you can see it's even more pronounced. Only 2 or 3% of them, which equates possibly to 1 or 2 people in each sample, associated white people with the negative constructs, but around about 1 in 5 associated the black people with the negative constructs. And then for gender, we see something similar, which is that men are more likely to be associated with the negativity around professional standards. And the point I often make is you do not want to be a black man in the professional standards investigation. You get the double whammy of both a race bias and a gender bias. And it's fairly consistent across the forces, you know, from West Yorkshire down to South Wales. We were getting very similar proportions. And we revisited, by the way, on the final bar, which I think is the yellow bar, we revisited one force 2 years later and retested, not the same people, just the people who worked in the department 2 years later. Some of them may be the same. And you can see, again, the results are very similar over time.
And this bias testing, was that the sort of testing that you described to us earlier on with the photographs of, for example, black and white faces and the descriptive words that were either had a positive or negative association?
All we did was change the words to be more reflective of the investigation process than we did with the original test.
You said a moment ago in your evidence that you wouldn't want to be a black man subject to an investigation by professional standards. And in paragraph 40 of your statement, and we won't bring this up on the screen, I would rather keep the slideshow up, but I'll read it out to you. You explain this slide, and you explain that what really got you into this training in the first place was that a number of forces had disparity in the outcome of their professional standards processes. Black officers were more likely to end up in trouble. And the National Black Police Association over the years had done research and presented an opinion that black police officers in particular are subject to discipline more often and more harshly than other officers might be. And so you've developed a particular version of the bias test in order to explore that.
The National Black Police Association are saying that that's an effect that's emerged since the Cousins case, where professional standards have started to really crack down on standards for police officers, that more black and Asian officers are being put forward for misconduct now than they were. And they're saying, well, we're seeing it again now.
I wonder if we can move on to slide 20. This is the concluding slide in a series of slides that came under the heading implicit bias and perceptions of criminality, and looks to be the conclusions of the slides that precede it. So you've recorded here the results of 7 studies showed that people have a bias to perceive black men as bigger, taller, heavier, more muscular, and more physically threatening, stronger, more capable of harm than young white men. Biased formidability judgments in turn promoted participants' justifications of hypothetical use of force against black suspects of crime. Thus, perceivers appear to integrate multiple pieces of information to ultimately conclude that black men are more physically threatening than white men, believing that they must therefore be controlled using more aggressive measures. And does that conclusion come from the study that you refer to in the bottom right? Or is that a conclusion that you have drawn based on all of the research that was listed on the previous slides?
That's from the study.
That's from the study.
Yeah, that was their conclusion of all the studies that had been looked at, which I then went back and looked at.
Okay. And we see that this study is reported in a journal called the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology in 2017. Can you tell us anything about that journal? Is that a UK journal or a US journal?
It's an international journal. It's one of the more highly regarded journals around personality.
Yeah, Yeah, I'm being reminded by my colleagues that we heard evidence at the beginning of this hearing on race from a professor, Meir, a university professor from Glasgow, who I understand also referred to this study in a research paper that he prepared for the inquiry. Now, you give an illustration here. Can you tell us about the illustration that you have included on this slide?
So at that time, PC Monk, Benjamin Monk, was a patrol PC sent with a colleague to deal with what effectively was a domestic dispute in terms of Dalian Atkinson, who I think people may know used to be a footballer, a professional footballer, I think for Aston Villa in his day. He'd been through some difficulties and he'd gone to his father's house in Telford and threatened to kill him. And PC Monk and his colleague arrived on the scene and Mr. Atkinson appeared on the doorstep. And if in the evidence given by PC Atkinson at his trial, he said he was enormous. But that's not the reality of the physicality of Dalian Atkinson. He was actually a little bit overweight. He was 5'9". He got a heart condition. He was far from being a peak physical subject. But he was then subjected by PC Monk to being kicked in the head whilst on the floor and being tasered 3 times. And he was convicted and sent to prison for manslaughter for doing that.
Can we move on to slide 30, please? Here you list a number of different types of bias. I wonder if you could perhaps pick out, say, half a dozen of the better known and tell us, just in a few words each, what they look like, how we might recognise these different types of bias.
I think there's something like 122 in the literature, but these are the ones which we see most frequently in organisations. The kind of underpinning one is affinity bias. If you look like me, sound like me, share my background, share my skin colour, I'm more likely to see you as one of those groups positively, which conversely means that people who are not like you tend to be seen less positively. And it underpins a lot of the other biases. So the other biases which then come in are driven by affinity bias, the fact that we like people who look like us. Attributional biases, we explain the causes of behaviour differently. So if somebody who is similar to us has a piece of positive behaviour, we tend to attribute that to them internally, so they're a good person. If they do something wrong, we attribute externally, so we blame the situation or the circumstances. People less like us, we often see the opposite, which is if they do something good, we attribute that to good luck or the circumstance, whereas if they do something bad, we blame them for it. We say it's their fault that they did it. Confirmation bias, we see what we expect to see. So we start off with the view of the world and then we seek out information that confirms that view and we ignore information that contradicts that view of the world or that set of circumstances. Source bias is an interesting one. So some sources of information are regarded as more valuable. So you're more likely to believe information that comes from certain sources without challenging it, whereas other sources you will not believe. But the affinity bias sits underneath that, which is if sources that are more like us are more likely to be believed than sources that are less like us. And the final one I think was interesting is possibly conformity effects. So we often don't want to do things that are different. We go with the flow, especially if somebody more senior is the person who's suggesting it. People do not like to be the odd one out, particularly when they've got a very senior person in the room or in the situation.
What is halo and horns effect?
So people have an attribute that you really like or you really dislike, and then that colours your whole perception of them. So, I don't know, they're a smoker, and you then attribute that their intelligence is not so good or that they've got poor health, something like that. So effectively it colours your whole perception based upon one thing that you either really like or you dislike. So they went to a certain school or university, then they get a positive vibe versus a negative vibe from other universities.
If we can move on to slide 32, please. Headed up System Actions. And this continues on to the following slide. So there are 11 system actions that are put forward for discussion in the context of this particular training exercise. Again, I wonder if I might invite you just to identify those which are most prominent or perhaps have the broadest application, and tell us just a little more about them.
I think the first one on the list is know your data. Too often organisations don't know the nature of the problem they have because they haven't got the data. And I'll give you an example of that. If you look at the data set that West Yorkshire Police have got around use of force, it's very, very detailed. You know, they know exactly what force was used against which particular people based on gender, based on ethnicity. So they're able to say which groups are more likely, for example, to be the subject of parva spray or a spit hood or something like that. And if you haven't got that data, you really don't know what the problem is. And if it's a recruiting problem, if you haven't got the data on your recruiting process of who's getting through and who's failing, then you really can't solve the problem. So it's the kind of underpinning one. Reviewing key decision-making processes. I mean, this example of that is a College of Policing have had a review done and they've unpicked their process, and it goes into number 5, really looking for marginal gains. There's no magic silver bullet in all of this. What there is often is small gains, small tweaks in the system that little by little erodes the opportunity for bias to actually get into the decision and into the behaviour that people have got. And sometimes just sitting down with those decisions, and I did some work for a large sports company about 2 years ago where we reviewed, I think it was 60 or 70 job applications, looking specifically for the kind of triggers that might induce certain jobs, putting them through software that could actually identify the kind of words that they were using. Very minor changes on occasions, just a word here and a word there. But it's that kind of approach. You might not be able to find the wonderful idea that actually cracks this, but you can erode it with these little steps.
Should we move on to the next slide, perhaps, and look at the additional points there? So another 5 points. Are there any there that you'd like to highlight?
Some of this is actually what we talked about earlier on in terms of things like promoting positive role models which counter the stereotypes. So when we see a good example, bring it to people's attention because that tends to erode people's capacity to fall back onto those stereotypes. Avoiding pejorative media releases. You know, the Metropolitan Police Twitter feed is a good example of that. There's also a couple of things within this about the perspective that we have. Asking white men to review stuff which is really designed for black minority ethnic groups, for example, or women, is unlikely to come up with the magic answer to it when the perspective is very much that. And I'll give you an example. RBS won't mind me saying this. When they were designing their new automatic telling machines, it was somebody who said, what about people with disabilities? Who actually got certain functionality put into it, which was not going to be put in because it was complex and expensive. But that person spotted the glitch in the system that allowed them then to put that right before they installed the machines. That's because they involved the people who were going to be the end users, if you like, in the process. And I think sometimes, you know, white men design lots of stuff without necessarily asking other people what it should look like.
Let's move on to the next slide. Personal actions. We touched on this earlier in your evidence when we talked about the thinking pauses. And I asked whether there were other steps that you could take on an individual basis, and you said there were many, and we agreed that we would come back to this because the slide was in the slideshow. I'm not sure I can read this. It's very, very small, but can you perhaps talk us through
came prepared, yeah.
at least a handful of these personal actions?
So this is much about what we found out when we did the review. So obviously we've talked about the insight that getting bias tests can do. Once we know what our biases are, if we are motivated to do something about them, we have an opportunity to intervene. Having contact, so this is known as the contact hypothesis, which is the more you have contact with a group for which you have a bias, the less likely you are to be able to maintain that bias, because nobody fits the stereotype perfectly. The more people you meet, the more you realise that those pigeonholes into which you put groups just don't work, and that enables us to break those down. Use of role models, we touched upon that, didn't we, which is the more that we have people who contradict the role model or are positive role models for a group, the more likely we are to mitigate our biases. Counter stereotypes, so that's the kind of flip side, is to say there is some slightly perverse research saying, by the way, that sometimes thinking of counter stereotypes makes it worse, not better. But most of the research says that if you think the opposite of a stereotype, saying I'm going to reject that stereotype, then it does have an effect, but you run the risk of triggering the stereotype for use, which is the worry. Perspective taking, so this has been widely rolled out, I think, asking people to stop for a minute and think, how would I like to be treated in those circumstances? Can I understand why that person is where they are at this moment in time? Avoiding reinforcement, we've talked a little bit about that, but even things like jokes, we often say, oh, it's just a joke. But the unconscious doesn't know that. It just wires that joke into the big ping pong ball of our brain for later use. Avoiding reinforcement, we've touched upon that, haven't we? But even if it's a question of making sure that the kind of media you absorb is not pejorative about particular groups. Avoiding the triggers, so we've spoken a little bit about how things like being rushed and stressed and angry and hungry can cause us to fall back on our biases. We can't always avoid the triggers, but when we can build it in to try not to make important decisions at times when those conditions are most prevalent, then that gives us a chance. And I'll give you an example. I did some work for one of the ombudsmen, and what they decided to do was, rather than making a complex decision at 3:45 on a Tuesday, they would always sleep on it. They would put a delay on the email going out to give them a chance to think it through overnight. And that was just a question of them saying, well, you know what, perhaps 3:45 on at the end of a really long day when people have been shouting at me all day is not a great time for making critical decisions. I'll make that one tomorrow morning when I'm refreshed, when I've had something to eat, and I'll get on with some admin for tonight. And that was a simple saying, if we can avoid the triggers. You can't always do it, can you? Because sometimes, you know, you've got to do it now. But avoiding the triggers is one thing. Certainly in a more office-based role is really easy. Slowing things down, so just trying to create those little thinking gaps along the way, and saying something about it. I thought it was really interesting the other day that people were saying, well, I knew that about that guy, but you never said anything. You never did anything in all that time. Nobody ever said, that's wrong. And the research would say that the best person to make a challenge on bad behaviour is a white man, somebody in the dominant, more powerful group, because people don't think that I've got a vested interest. They don't think, well, he would say that because he's a woman. He would say that because he's gay. He would say that because he's black. So when we say it, A, because we're the more powerful group, secondly, because we have no vested interest in making the challenge often, then that's why it's more important that people actually in fact step up and say, you know what, that's out of order. That's not right. I can't see number 10. It's got to be a list of 10 or 11, isn't it?
I think it's actually 9. I've got a smaller
right.
version on my screen. If we scroll down, there we are. I think it is just 9. Thank you. You say elsewhere in your statement, I think at paragraph 70, if you want people to do this kind of stuff and do it instinctively, it has to be easy to implement, it has to be really, really low on demand, and they have to have the time to practice it.
Yeah. So we don't really want to be giving people load to extra load at times when they actually need all of their thinking power to deal with the situation in front of them. But you've got to give them the time to practice it, you know, to pass it back. There was a piece of research in the States on the police use of firearms that found that well-trained firearms officers were able to at least overcome in part some of their biases around race, simply because they'd practiced and practiced and practiced, and they'd passed that training back into their unconscious. They didn't have to think about what to do now. It was automatic.
Finally, can we look briefly at slide 39, please? So we've looked at the advice that might be given at an organisational level to counteract unconscious or implicit bias, steps that an individual can take, and now you have a slide headed organisational and leader actions. And again, I wonder if you could very quickly talk us through this, perhaps highlighting key points for leaders.
Yeah, I mean, leaders are quite good with data, but they have to have the data. You know, they have to gather the data. And I know the Bank of England, when they started off on their journey, they spent 12 months just getting the data right before they started to implement anything. They need to have the data. But I often talk to leaders about being brave and not fragile. Sometimes that they, inside organisations, they got a lot of people whispering in their ears, well, we can't do that, we shouldn't do that. Sometimes they just have to not listen to those people. I call them the boss whisperers. Stop listening to the boss whisperers and get on and do it. So I think that sometimes there is a kind of call to arms for leaders to say, well, you're a leader, you're paid to be a leader. Get on and do it. Don't be having this second guessing all the time. Reviewing processes, usually leaders in organisations, the people who've got the gift, they're the people saying, I own this process, I can tell you we need to review it. The person operating the system often doesn't. They've just got the front end. Using diverse panels and having somebody there to challenge the decision. You know, sometimes it's just having somebody as the devil's advocate, if you like, to say, well, can we look at that in a different way? Why are we doing that? And sometimes just having somebody with that role to push back can stop people do that. And across the organisation, that idea of, you know, creating the opportunities for the stuff we've said they should be doing, rather than making it difficult for do that. You know, having contact, for example. If you make it difficult, they're not going to get the contact.
Anything else you'd like to highlight from this slide?
Right, okay. Building accountability. We're certainly seeing that with the police race action plan that's going in England and Wales. If the senior leaders are not asking people, well, what progress are we making? Where are we with it? Nothing gets done. If they don't actually, and the crime commissioners have not been asking chief constables, well, where are we making progress with this? If nobody's asking if it's getting done, nobody's going to get done. So accountability, I think, is really important. And there's a system change around things like creating space in the stop search situations.
Thank you. Can you bear with me for just a second, please? We have no further questions. Thank you, Dr. Jones.
Are there any Rule 9 applications? No. Dr. Jones, thank you very much for coming to give evidence to the inquiry. I'm very grateful for the time. Inquiry's about to adjourn for the day, and you'll then be free to go. Adjourn until tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock.